My name is Dr. Bambi Hayes-Brown, and I serve as the President and Chief Executive Officer of Georgia Advancing Communities Together, also known as Georgia ACT. And we are a statewide nonprofit affordable housing and community development membership organization. And I come to you today not only as the CEO of Georgia ACT, but also as someone who has lived experience of being homelessness while I was pregnant with my youngest son and my older two children, as well as a former practitioner who has managed a homeless program in DeKalb County. Just to give you some context, back in 2019, it was just before the pandemic, and I met with a few housing advocates, and we were talking about how to solve the eviction crisis in Fulton County. And most of these advocates were very well-known, well-respected nationally and internationally, and called upon to give testimony in various occasions. However, I asked one question: how many of those advocates had actually been in the Fulton County's eviction court? Not one. So tell me, how can you really understand what the problem is, but you're called on as an expert, but you've never even been to a Fulton County eviction court? Of course, I have. And unfortunately, when I was a property manager in Southwest Atlanta, I had to actually conduct evictions. I guess that's why I'm not doing property management anymore. When I look at the things in the documentary, No Address, Atlanta, and if you have not seen that, it is the best $14 I have ever spent to rent and watch, because it highlights how only a few organizations control the millions of dollars in funding and control the decisions of homelessness. And according to past Atlanta president Felicia Moore, there is a disconnect between the controllers of the funding administrators, the continuum of care, against those who are doing the on-the-ground work and those who are unsheltered. And I have heard this throughout my career, and I heard one of my friends and advocates, we pray for his healing, Marshall Ransford, stated that one time he had conducted a lead agency in Atlanta regarding an issue for the unhoused. He did receive a call, but it was 6 months later. I requested assistance from my fellow advocates that are part of an ad hoc state housing working group to aid our partners in Valdosta, Georgia. So you're right, Mr. Chairman, this is not just an Atlanta issue. Only the Housing Justice League, who is an on-the-ground grassroots organization that's also severely underfunded, responded. So I come to you to see how many of my fellow advocates, some of whom will speak today, scholars, academians, in this homeless space, has taken the time to live without shelter on the hottest day of the year, as well as try to live without shelter on the coldest day of the year, and try not to die like the 28 unsheltered people who died due to hypothermia because of the cities of Atlanta's slow response to open home warming shelters. Accompany an unsheltered brother or sister through navigating this continuum of care while trying to navigate intake, getting all of the required documents. And a lot of these organizations are, guess what, closed on the weekends. Like homelessness doesn't occur on the weekends. Accompany family in Valdosta through the application for the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, only to submit that program 4, 5, and 6 times, only to get an email saying that they are approved, and then another email saying they're denied. And guess what? Try contacting someone to get a solution. Then you see the same fate that Senator Davenport so eloquently put. Then the constituents start calling you all because they can't get any assistance. One of the things that we often do in this space is we refer to data, focus groups, surveys, but rarely do those who will say, well, we don't provide direct services, move away from the comforts of their homes or their Zoom meetings and do like Senator Summers, Senator Jackson, and actually go out into the community, whether you ride, whether you walk, whether you drive by foot, anything, to talk to those who are unsheltered. Find out from them what their needs are. So you're not getting second and third hand information based on data. Just like Judge said, it's so true. As someone who travels around this state, to hear that homelessness has declined, even back in 2019, is laughable, because the public perception is the reality. Tell someone who is unhoused that homelessness is declining. And I know that Senator Summers faced a lot of flack when this bill first came out, to say, oh, well, he just rode around and saw what he saw. Well, guess what? Go view No Address Atlanta, and that validates everything that Senator Summers, Senator Jackson, who goes out and do this work on the ground, and that they do. Although the numbers and reasons for homelessness are vast, the numbers of homelessness continue to increase, as Commissioner Nunn stated. So according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, 73% of extremely low income renters are cost burdened, which means they pay more than 50% of their income for rent. Georgia has only 39 available units for 100 extremely low income families. And then in the state of Georgia, a person has to make $20.97 per hour to afford a modest 2-bedroom unit. And God forbid, if they're making minimum wage, they have to work 116 hours per week to afford a 2-bedroom unit. So as a former practitioner of homelessness, and as someone who is also participating in those point in time counts, which we know are only estimates, and when we go out and do those counts, it goes by what we see and people that we can count in shelters. But talk to Helen Cummings about the people that you're not going to see. Because a lot of times those who are unsheltered don't want to be seen or don't want to be found. Because we talk about in this bill the criminalization of homelessness. Well, guess what? It's been happening. It already happens. We talk about things such as compassionate closures, when people don't have a place to put their tents, and boulders are now put in place. These encampments are raised, and now people lose all the things that they need to get services: identification, birth certificates, medications, bus passes, cell phones. So we're also still feeling the effects of the closure of Peachtree and Pine Shelter. And I volunteered at that shelter from 2001 until 2013. So no one can tell me about, oh, well, Peachtree and Pine Shelter. Yes, they had some issues, of course, but it did serve a need. Just like the time when I was sitting in a meeting and people talked about closing these extended stay hotels because of all of the seedy things that was happening. And I challenged them to get out of their office and go at 7:30 in the morning to those extended stays, at 3:30 in the afternoon to those extended stays. And tell me, won't you see children that are out there? Because I lived in one for 3 years. So I know what I'm talking about. Tell that to the people who have already spent 28 days in jail in the city of Atlanta, the 500 intents to evict in Valdosta, Lowndes County, the almost 300 eviction filings in Fitzgerald, Ben Hill County, and the lady who lived in an encampment in Valdosta under a tree, and the tree limb fell on her and she died. These are real stories that are happening. You're not going to see this in the data, and you're going to hear a lot about data. But we want to really look at those who are doing the work on the ground, who are oftentimes left out of the conversation of the solutions and are often left out of the money, such as the beloved Community Development Corporation that provides rest and respite for those who are unhoused, food, charging stations, showers, clothes washing stations. And they only need $7,000 to complete their Little Zion Annex that serves the Pittsburgh community of Southwest Atlanta. $7,000. And with $30,000 a year, they can have full operations. $30,000 a year. But we, and it's a great question about how many millions of dollars are coming into the community, but how many are coming to those grassroots organizations like Fitzgerald for Change, who are fielding those calls from people who need rental assistance, who qualify for the balance of states rental assistance, but are unable to get the assistance, and the landlords just can't hold out. So they have to file those evictions. So some solutions, as Senator Robertson, I think you stole a little bit of my thunder, have an independent periodic review along with metrics and benchmarks of the success or failures of those agencies who are currently administrating government dollars on homelessness, local, state, and federal. Of course, remove any criminalization of the unsheltered. We all agree on that. Solutions that are led by those with lived experience and those who are doing on-the-ground grassroots work, and those persons of color, because they are the ones that are disproportionately affected by homelessness. But in these spaces, when it's time to talk in front of the White House or sometimes in front of a group such as this, they're left out of the conversations. And even those who are allies, unintentionally or intentionally, depending on who you ask, want to mediate what we're going to say. What those of us who have done the on-the-ground work and have that lived experience. We need, our expertise is just as valuable as those academians and attorneys, and no shade on attorneys, or academians, are all of these experts. We are the experts because we have been there, done that. We need equitable, low barrier distribution of homelessness dollars to those on the ground nonprofits. We need increased funding for long-term housing solutions, including permanent supportive housing and some of the other solutions that you're here today. Also consider those innovative short-term housing solutions, those low barrier shelters, tiny homes, shipping container homes that Jessica Lewis and Tony Popes talks about in the documentary No Address. Provide funding for those like Erica Wright with You First that provides hand washing stations, and Justice for All, and my friend Marsha Ransford that aids the unhoused with mental illness and substance abuse. And lastly, again, view the documentary No Address from Carlotta Harris and take heed to those solutions in the documentary. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and committee, and I'll be glad to entertain any questions now. I do plan to be around later today.
Dr. Brown, excellent testimony. Thank you kindly for that, and I appreciate your own, as we say, your own spirits, own hand job there. You're there. One question, well, actually two, before we let you go. The criminal part, thank you for bringing up the part about the criminalization in that bill that was dropped last year. It simply was that bill basically mirrored what was already on the books with Georgia law in regards to a police officer having the right to say, if you don't move after a while, I have the right to arrest you to move you. Nobody wants to criminalize anybody. Thank you for pointing that out. That was not part of it. But people want to focus on that because they don't want to focus on the issue. And thank you for pointing out the issue on that, where we're at, because you're hands-on. Thank you very much for that. And one more thing, let me rephrase that. From what I gather from you, you're basically saying there's no accountability to the massive amount of funding that's coming into Georgia. Is that correct? That
is correct, because you will hear one thing from the administrators of the program,
right?
But you all are hearing something different from your constituents.
Absolutely.
As well as we are, because we get those phone calls to Senator Davenport a lot. And so that's what I would like to see.
Okay.
as an outcome from this committee.
Okay.
And it needs to be independent. And because we, I think the judge here said it all.
What number you mind, Senator?
It's kind of I'll be shocked if you know it. Do you know how many programs are out there that provide assistance?
I wish I did. Unfortunately, I don't.
And that's kind of why I was asking the question, because every time I hear somebody talk, I'm hearing about another program that's available, but we don't have a full list of.
How do you get it?
Yeah. And you probably need that information more than I do.
That is correct. Because we need to know where to send families, but we don't want to have families just going around in a circle saying, okay, well, dial 211 and here's a list of agencies. And well, this agency, well, the list is outdated. We don't have any funding, or we don't have any services available, or come back at 2 o'clock on a Monday while you're trying to work and you're at work at 2 o'clock. So it would be helpful to have a comprehensive list of that. And even though we know it will change and it will be a working list, but it will be great for those of us who are doing the work on the ground and our partners who are doing the work on the ground to have.
Since we're trying to figure that thing out and get solutions on that one, part two on that is I would like to see how much of those dollars are spent on admin costs for the entity and how much are going to the costs.
Absolutely.
I agree. And I think that is a great idea because when I look at the beloved community who only needs $7,000 and to finish their capital project and $30,000 a year to help families. And as stated in the No Address documentary, I'm not saying this is me, but they are saying that there are some program administrators that receive pay in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Don't doubt it. Commissioner,
Thank you for being here. First of all, are you an executive producer on No Address Atlanta?
I am not. I have never met Miss Harris.
No.
But she was spot on.
I'm just joking with you.
If
you could start promoting Robertson for Georgia, I'd appreciate that.
Okay.
But in all seriousness, and to the majority leader's question, when I reached into the budget office here in the state capitol and asked them that question, where I wanted to see where all the funding for homelessness was going into, and understand, I look at it as a two-part thing. I look at unsheltered differently than I look at traditional homelessness.
Right.
And I think it's important that we do that, because when we look at traditional homelessness, we can have a conversation about what the judge is talking about the market, housing, apartment availability, and things like that. I think when we get over into the unsheltered, a lot of times the market doesn't impact it as much as substance abuse, mental health issues, and other things related to disconnectivity at home, whether it's, my oldest child grew up in a generation where she had friends that all through college, they couch surfed and attended college, but they never had a residence. So we have to be very careful about that. But do you notice while you're out there, and you mentioned this nonprofit that needs $7,000, and of course, the first thought that popped into my mind is, there not a church out there that's willing to write this nonprofit a check for $7,000? And is there not 3 churches out there that are willing to each give them $10,000 a year to run this program, which sounds like a part of the solution? But as a young law enforcement officer, United Way was the clearinghouse for all of these things.
Right.
And a lot of people didn't like United Way because a portion of any contribution had administrative strings to it. But what we discovered is if they were administering most of the funding to these programs, we saved money on the administrative costs of all these individual programs.
Right.
In other words, there was a point of contact and things were done that way. And it seems we've moved away from that model into where everybody wants to establish their program, and in some cases their kingdoms. And because throughout the legislative session, every advocate that comes and sits before us throws out a new acronym, some new
Right.
name or something like that. And it's gotten to the point to where I, as a law enforcement officer, have become so jaded and cynical because I understand that you can take $20 and go start a 501c3 in the state of Georgia.
That's true.
And I'm a little conservative when it comes for me handing somebody taxpayer dollars to a group that does not have a track record and is not affiliated with somebody that is reputable and has been vetted. So God bless you. I appreciate what you do. And I'm certainly going to watch the documentary and see what all that's about. But thank you again.
Yes, thank you. No address. Thank you. Thank you so much. And that is a valid point. My agency in transparency has received money from United Way of Greater Atlanta. Before all of this federal dollars came out, we had our own rental assistance program. And we had a 7-day turnaround with giving out money because I was driving the checks to the apartment complexes myself. But I agree. But we just need those agencies such as United Way or those who are handling the money to widen the table, to broaden the table, to include those small community development organizations who are asking for just a little bit of money that has a great impact.
Okay, last question from Senator Jackson.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of your work, Dr. Brown. I really appreciate it. Dr. Hayes-Brown.
Thank you.
Just thinking about your issue around wanting to make sure that the grassroots agencies have access to the federal dollars. So I think, to be clear, these are federal funds, which come with a lot of rules and regulations. I run a small church. I personally do not have the capacity administratively to be able to fulfill all of the documentation, all the paperwork that would be required in order to actually receive federal dollars. And so I'm curious, I know all the agents, I know all the groups that you've named, right? How would you solve that problem without adding to people's administrative burden, right? I mean, the thing is, we don't want to pay executives to have to do this work, but the fact is, federal dollars require true documentation, lots of paperwork. There's accountability that's been built into it. And if you're an agency that runs with 2 people, how are they supposed to meet those needs, and what solution might you offer for that problem?
Well, I'll give you a perfect example of that. And so I'm not talking about just federal or state dollars that these larger agencies need to share. I'm talking about private philanthropic dollars also. What we don't want to see, and I advocate on the federal level as well, and as someone who worked for a housing authority for 10 years, trust me, I know bureaucracy and paperwork, who's administered several of these programs that we are talking about today. That's why we advocated to Department of Treasury, who is running who is administering the ERA programs, as opposed to HUD on the federal level, to loosen a lot of those federal requirements that you would just see in your traditional programs. So a lot of things such as, the federal government, Department of Treasury, they do allow people to get the funding directly to the renter. They don't require Social Security cards. But when the administrators of those programs add on additional requirements that are not required by the federal government, then that causes another problem. And so I have seen that also with the states. But we also need those who get the funding to work with those nonprofits who may not have the capacity. Because our small nonprofits, some who are represented here today, are tired of hearing that they don't have the capacity, when those larger nonprofits are receiving the bulk share of the dollars and the bulk share of the administrative costs. And again, as in the documentary stated, those are the ones that are getting the 6-figure incomes. But we need them to work with those on the ground grassroots nonprofits and share with them. And it may not be necessary. Resources is not just money. It's your best practices, things that you do that could help build the capacity of that nonprofit. I do a lot of that. colleague here for Fitzgerald for Change, she will tell you, I give a lot of free, what I call free technical assistance to them. And that's what we need our agencies who are administering these funding, having their staff, if they don't do it, have a staff or member or someone dedicated to assisting these nonprofits so that they can work together as opposed to against each other.